Okay, everybody. Hello there. Welcome to week number 4 of Qualitative and Quantitative Research Introduction. This week we'll be talking about a number of things. We're going to, uh, I know you're turning in your articles or your uh, research list, your list of research articles. And the other thing that we're going to work on this week is you're going to move forward with developing your research hypothesis. So uh, we'll talk a little bit about that in this lecture, and we'll talk about it on Thursday. But we also are going to talk about the basics of quantitative research and the basics of developing a research proposal from a quantitative research perspective. So I wanted to kind of start there with this week's video lecture. So, one second. So, um, so let me talk a little bit. So we'll talk about a research proposal, and we'll talk about the different types of research design, and we'll even talk a little bit about a hypothesis. But let me um, go into here some of the basics regarding what we're actually talking about when we talk about quantitative research. And I know we've covered this in class, but I really wanted to go into some detail here as far as what is quantitative research, what makes for a quantitative um, research uh, topic, a quantitative uh, research um, proposal, what is in it. But what really do we mean when we talk about a quantitative research topic or quantitative research question? Basically, what is quantitative research and how does it distinguish from qualitative research? And we'll talk about qualitative research, but quantitative research, um, as I said before, but really it bears repeating. The main thing that um, distinguishes quantitative research from qualitative research is the idea of numbers and statistics. When you are using quantitative research, you are in one way or another reducing all the information you have to some set of numbers that you can use, and then you are running statistical analyses on those numbers. And um, the so this could be anything as uh, direct as, let's say you're studying depression and you would use the Beck Depression Inventory, which some of you may be familiar with. The Beck Depression Inventory is a scale of 21 items. And I believe I talked to you some about this earlier in the course. It's 21 items, and what you do is the person answers each item. There are four choices for each one, and uh, the each item is given a score from 0 to 4, and you can even look at it. It has a lot of what we call face validity. You may remember I used that term before. Face validity, of course, meaning that the items, it's pretty clear what the items are at. So zero, the items that are scored 0, you can look at them. They clearly um, represent no level of depression, and 4 clearly is a very high level of depression. 0 might be I have never thought of killing myself. 4 would be I have frequent thoughts of killing myself. So, and then you score them up. But where I'm going with this is with the Beck Depression Inventory, what happens is For each item, you get 0 to 4, and then you add up all 21, and that is your Beck Depression Inventory score. The higher the score, the more depression um, you are likely to have. And the one thing that's interesting about the Beck Depression Inventory is it was normed, it was developed on psychiatric patients. So it's not only good for distinguishing depression from someone who doesn't have any sort of psychiatric illness, it is also good for distinguishing someone who has depression from someone who has anxiety. Uh, so, but the higher the score, the more depression you have. So that's a pretty straightforward way of distinguishing it. You have um, uh, sometimes the data the datum that you use for something like depression is you have a score on a depression instrument, and so um, the higher the score. Excuse me, I'm fixing my screen here and bumped it up a little bit. The higher the score, the more depression the person has. Okay. So that would be a pretty straightforward way of a quantitative measure. However, sometimes you may have an interview with somebody. Now, interviews, surveys are typically connected to qualitative research, but it may be that in your that what you want to do is take those interviews and simply analyze something like how often the person mentions feeling sad. So in that case, you might go through the interview and count the number of times the person mentions feeling sad. Possibly, um, you might be looking, for instance, on trying to determine how much mentioning sadness or mentioning loss has to do with depression. So, what you might do, this is just an example, is you would possibly take the Beck Depression Inventory, where you have a score for every individual that you're looking at, and you would um, uh, gather up those scores and for each individual, and then uh, you might, for instance, go to an interview that you have with every one of these subjects, and you would count the number of times the person mentions loss or sadness in their interview. It would simply be a number of, it would simply be a frequency count. How frequently does the person mention the things you're measuring or the things you're looking at? So how often do they mention sadness? How often do they mention loss? How many times in the interview do they mention those things? And so where I'm going with this is in the interview, you would count out the number of times certain things are mentioned, and that would be the frequency count. But that's a number. So that's why it's quantitative. Interviews are often connected to qualitative research, but they can be used for quantitative research if what you're doing is, for instance, counting the frequency with which a person mentions a certain thing. So it could be as straightforward as you have an instrument, the person gets a score on an instrument, the higher the score, the more they have depression or anxiety or whatever you want to fill in the blanks. Or it could be a frequency count where the number of times the person says something or does something, you count the frequency with which it occurs. Um, Another way of doing it could simply be assigning numbers to different categories. Let's say, for instance, I want to do a study on whether um, individuals who are um, uh, depressed mention loss and mention um, sadness more often, whether that association is more often something that occurs in the northern part of the country or in the southern part of the country. So, another variable that I would make quantitative is I would possibly say that if they're from the northern part of the country, there's a one, and if they're from the southern part of the country, they get a two. So in that case, for that variable, location, I assign a one or a two. Now notice it's a number, but notice in that case, the number has no value. I could easily reverse them and make southern part of the country one and northern part two. So the numbers have no value, but they are still numbers. They are still quantitative. Quantitative comes down to numbers, even if you are getting the numbers, if you are assigning the numbers for in different ways. Notice in the example that I just gave, where I would have a study of um, the number of times people um, mention loss or sadness in an interview, if that is related to the amount of clinical depression that they have, and whether that differs in northern or southern parts of the country. My theory could be, for instance, I could come up with that as a research question with the theory that, say, people in the southern part of the country are more hesitant, more resistant to talking with people they don't know about how they're feeling, and to admitting to things that um, uh, might be leading to their depression. So even if they are depressed, they may not be as comfortable talking about it with people they don't know. There's a theory. And so my hypothesis might be individuals in the north, then part of individuals in the north, um, have a stronger relationship of how often they mention things like losses and sadness um, than people in the South. Now, notice I just came up with that as a hypothetical research design, but notice it uses three different ways of reporting data: scores on an instrument, the higher the score, the the higher the score, the higher the level of depression. Um, Frequency count, how frequently something occurs in a certain um, time period, and numbers that are assigned just to reflect a variable where the numbers don't have any meaning. So notice, other than they are related to a certain category, categorical variables. Notice there that I have three different variables that I'm looking at, each one measured a certain way, but the one thing they all have in common is all of them have numbers. I've come up with numbers for each of them. And so um, everything is brought down to a set of numbers. Okay, and that's what makes a quantitative study a quantitative study. Now, there are three different levels of information about your study that you start off with when you do a quantitative study. You have the general research topic, the whole sort of overall thing. That's kind of where you all needed to be for your references list. You needed to have a general idea of what the topic is that you are focusing on. You needed to have a general topic. Um, Following your general topic, you need to have a specific research question. A research question is much more specific than a research topic. Um, I my in the hypothetical example I just gave a minute ago, my research topic is depression and its relationship to people's self-report. Um, the specific research question that I'm asking is, um, do individuals in the North have a stronger tendency to talk about loss and sadness when they're experiencing a higher level of clinical depression? That is a specific research question. And then the third piece of information that I would have is a hypothesis. My hypothesis is individuals in the North will have a stronger relationship between um, their levels of self report of loss or sadness uh, to their level of clinical depression compared to people in the South. Okay. So, so there is my research hypothesis. Now, as I mentioned before, and I'm going to be using some, um, I'm going to be using some terms that I know we talked about before, but I kind of want to have it all one place as we start here at the uh, in sort of a summation of the basics of quantitative design. Um, when you have quantitative research, quantitative research means not only numbers, it also means statistics, statistical analyses. So when you are using um, quantitative research, when you're developing a quantitative research proposal, you will want to have a general research topic. You will want to have a specific research question. You will want to have a specific hypothesis. And you will want to decide what sort of statistical analyses, sort of statistical test you are going to use. And we will talk about that at different times throughout the course. We will not actually be running statistics here. I may show you some examples of them, but we will not specifically be running statistical tests here. But we will be talking about them. They will be a part of um, what you have in your research proposal. So, just to give now, I expect all of you have had statistics on some level or another in your undergraduate work, but let me just, for the sake of discussion here, go into how what different categories they all fall into. In I'm sorry, the different types of statistics and what sort of general categories they fall into. So there are a lot of different um, statistical tests. The main ones are t-test. T-test is when you are comparing two groups. Um, so if I only wanted to see in my experiment if people from the north have higher depression than people in the south, if all I was using was basically two variables. One is called the dependent variable, and one is called the independent variable. And if my specific research question was, do people in the north have more clinical depression, higher levels of clinical depression than people in the south? I would use a t-test, and my dependent variable, which is the variable that is impacted by at least one of the other, the variable being impacted by the other variable that you're studying, that that in this case would be clinical depression, scores on the Beck Anxiety Inventory. So if I am looking to see if those two groups are different, that is the main variable I'm looking at. That's the one that I'm looking at to see if it's different. The independent variable is the one that you are saying is causing the difference. And in this case, the independent variable would be where the person is located. So if you think about it in a very general way, the the dependent variable is the one that is you are looking to see if it changes. The independent variable is the variable that you're looking at to see if it causes the changes. Although saying that something definitely causes one thing or another is not something we do readily in quantitative research. We don't say that something is proved, and we don't say definitively that one thing caused the other thing. We might say that there's evidence that there's cause there, but we don't necessarily come right out and say this one thing caused the other. So, but just for the sake of definition, for the sake of you understanding the terms, that's where we're coming from. That in the just a general picture of what we're looking at when we're doing research, the the independent variable would be the one that is sort of thought to be causing the changes. The That's the independent variable. The dependent variable is the one that has changed. So a t-test, you have one dependent variable and one independent variable. Um, a second statistical test is called the ANOVA. And the ANOVA allows for multiple independent variables and multiple dependent variables. I won't get into a hypothetical example there, but I can. But just so as to uh, not get into, we'll talk about ANOVAs later on. But ANOVAs allow for multiple dependent variables and multiple independent variables. The thing about ANOVAs is you still have to you have to split the individuals into different categories. So, for instance, my independent variables would need to be so for instance, independent variables could be things like geographical location, but it would still have to be split into north and south. My independent variable could be levels of depression, but the independent variables would still have to be split into high levels of depression and low levels of depression. You cannot do a continuum with your independent variables. They have to be split into groups. Your dependent variable can be continuous, but your independent variable has to be split into groups. So it has to be things like high level of depression compared to low level depression, geographical location, north, south. If you were studying lighting and its impact on test results, high level of lighting, low level light, it has to be split into groups. The independent variables cannot be continuous. In order to do a study where all the variables can be continuous, The most basic one is called a correlation study. And a correlation study is, again, one dependent variable and one independent variable, but both of them can be continuous. You basically are looking at how does one increasing or decreasing impact whether the other one increases or decreases. And so rather than studying one group versus another group, as you do in a t-test and as you do in an ANOVA, a correlation is it can be one variable and another variable, but you don't split them into groups. You just study them as on a continuous level. So as one goes up, you study whether the other goes up. Um, a correlation coefficient, the most basic correlation coefficient, is called the Pearson's correlation coefficient. And the Pearson's correlation coefficient is on a scale from 0 to 1, and it can be positive or negative. A positive correlation coefficient means that as your independent variable goes up, your dependent variable goes up. Your a negative um, correlation coefficient would mean that as one variable goes up, the other goes down. So they are related, but in a different way. And the magnitude tells you the strength of the relationship. So a perfect positive correlation, which would be 1.0, that's the highest positive correlation you can have, would mean that literally every instance where the independent variable is going up, the dependent variable is going up. A negative 1.0 would mean that there's a perfect relationship. In every instance, as the one variable goes up, the other variable goes down. 0. So you got negative 1.0, positive 1.0, and the middle is 0. 0.0 means there's absolutely no relationship whatsoever between the two. It's completely unrelated. And then the level of magnitude shows you how strong of a positive or negative relationship you have between the two variables. Okay. Correlation coefficients often lead to the saying that correlation does not mean causation. And that is a statement that reflects that when you have a positive correlation between two variables, you do not necessarily know if another variable may be impacting those two. Example is there is a very strong correlation. This is one of the more famous examples that gets brought up. There's a very strong positive correlation between numbers of drowning and the amount of ice cream eaten. Um, so the amount of drownings in an area and the amount of ice cream area eaten in an area are strongly positively correlated. Now, looking at that, you might wonder, well, how does one cause the other? Well, you can't ask that question because it's clearly the case that one doesn't cause the other. What happens is they both are strongly correlated with another variable, time of the year. So there tends to be more drownings in the summer because people are swimming more than there are in the winter. And there tends to be more ice cream eaten in the summer than in the winter. So in this case, you see how sort of what the meaning behind that phrase, correlation does not mean causation. They are strongly related, but one is not causing the other. What you have is a third variable that is playing a role that isn't part of the study, that isn't part of what's being looked at. Now, a more complicated version of correlation. Correlation lays the base of a lot of research, and a more positive, I'm sorry, no, a more complex type of correlation study for looking at multiple independent variables and their effect on one dependent variable is called regression analysis. And regression analysis is basically a correlation study, a correlational study where um, you have multiple independent variables and you're looking at how they relate to one dependent variable. And then you can get into a whole bunch of other types of regression analysis. There's one called a MANOVA, MANOVA, all capital letters, which is basically an ANOVA, but for a regression analysis. What that means is you can have multiple dependent variables and multiple independent variables. But you are studying the relationship between them on a continuous basis as opposed to studying them where the independent variables have to be split into groups. Okay. And then when you are looking at quantitative research, you want to take into account a few things that are very important for the scientific method. And we will study many of these issues in more detail as we move on. But one of the key factors that you want to keep in mind when you're conducting a quantitative research study is the issue of randomization. You want to try as much as possible to randomly assign individuals to different groups if you're going to split them into groups. And that is why t-test and ANOVA are considered the more purely scientific statistical analyses than correlations and regression analysis. Because in order to split individuals into groups, you are expected to assign them to groups randomly. That is not necessarily a step that you need to take with a correlation study or a regression analysis. But the idea is that if you split people into groups as part of your study, you want to try to do that as randomly as possible. So, for any sort of quantitative research that you conduct, you want to try to randomly assign people to groups whenever you have to have them in different groups, to whatever degree that is possible. So, and really the better way to think of that rather than is to think that research studies sort of follow a continuum. And in one continuum, all the variables are controlled. And or that's one end of the continuum. That is considered to be the end of the continuum that is more in line with the pure scientific method. All the variables are controlled. And then on the other end of the spectrum is the variables are not controlled at all. And really all you are doing is observing the variables or really just observing what happens and observing the impact of the variables, but you are not trying to control them. You are not really running an experiment. You are more observing and reporting. That's the other end of the continuum. I have a very strong interest, for instance, in the interconnectedness between what is called comparative psychology and clinical psychology. Comparative psychology is the study of behavior across all animal species, including humans. And one of the reasons I like that is because comparative psychology is a much more purely scientific field of psychology than human psychology. When you are studying animal behaviors, you can control more of the variables. With some animals that are studied, certain flies, for instance, on behavior, they only have a lifespan of a couple days, so you can literally control everything that happens in their environment for those 3 days or so. So even though uh, those flies don't share physiologically much with human beings, they share enough that we can gather from studying them some understanding of what behavior means across species, how behavior is impacted across all animal species. And so I like the studying the interconnectedness of them because we want to try to glean as much information as we can that's relevant from those studies because they are much more objective, they are much more controlled, they are much more purely scientific than studies on human. So in many ways, as far as psychology goes, comparative psychology, non-human animal studies are much further down the end of the fully controlled uh, area of quantitative research than human research. If you think about it, sort of on the other end of the spectrum is would be, for instance, studies on criminal behavior. Because you can't control at all the variables of who winds up being a criminal or not. When you study criminal behavior and you're studying the differences between people who commit crimes and those who do not, you're just basically observing. You're not controlling any variable because the dependent variable, whether the person commits a crime or not, or what crime they commit, is so potentially damaging to society, you can't even um, you can't even entertain the idea of saying, well, maybe we'll just hold something back from this group, or maybe we'll do something this group and see if they end up committing a crime or not. That is something that you have no control over. So you have no, when you're studying criminal behavior, you have no control of the variable. You basically are observing and trying to figure out what variables play a role without really having any impact on how those variables have a role or whether they occur or not or anything along those lines. And when we get into ethics, we will see that some of the history of there being a strong and solid ethical code for psychologists doing research is because there were studies where people did not commit crimes, but for a variety of reasons were made to think that they committed crimes. And those were so damaging to the individuals who were involved in the study, the subjects, that that they wrote an ethical code basically saying psychologists can't do that. The one study that's pretty famous is one about, and we may get to this when we talk about ethics, but was a study where uh, graduate students were made to think that they were delivering electrical shocks to people in another room when they got answers wrong. And the dials were set up so it looked like, the shock would go up, but it clearly was in a safe range. But and the reason they knew or they thought it was in a safe range was because the dial had a big red mark on the higher numbers that said danger, do not administer. And the focus of the study was whether the researcher who was uh, working with these individuals, whether they could convince the person to turn the dial into that red zone even when it said danger, and even though they could hear the screams of the person in the other room who was receiving the shocks. Now, as many of you may know, if you heard this story before, there was nobody in the other room actually getting a shock. It was somebody. It was somebody acting as if they were getting a shock, but they weren't actually getting it. But even though they weren't really hurting someone, and even though they were told later that they hadn't actually hurt someone, the thought that they might have, and the thought or the reality that they would have been willing to do that just because someone was telling them to do it was very damaging emotionally to many of these people who were involved in being subjects, to the point that the ethical code was written to say, you can't do that. But anyway, so that was an example of how ethics sometimes takes away control that researchers can have over variables or over what groups people are assigned to. It is a reflection of how much control over you have uh, that you have over the variables altogether. So there's a continuum in psychological research, from having no control over the variables whatsoever to having, almost total control over variables. And in now it's interesting to keep in mind that there is this term in research called quasi experimental. And quasi experimental is a term that is used to reflect uh, studies where the scientific method isn't being followed 100%, that there are limits to how much the scientific method is actually being followed. And one of the questions of is the scientific method being completely followed is how much randomization is there? And another question is how much control does the researcher have over the variables? And with the randomization, that's related to the question of how much control does the experimenter have over what groups the different individuals go into. So really, the difference between quasi-experimental and experimental is how much control does the researcher have over the variables being studied. And a lot of individuals in the what is called the hard science, like biology, physics, all what we would consider to be, like I said, the hard science, as opposed to psychology, which is considered to be a social science. A lot of individuals in the hard sciences would say that all research in psychology is quasi-experimental. That at least all research in human psychology is quasi-experimental, because you never have, when it comes to human beings, you never have total control of all the variables that that could potentially impact the outcome. So that's a little bit of an explanation of why, in many, in the eyes of many individuals involved with the scientific community, all human psychological research is quasi experimental, because the researcher does not have total control over all of the variables, nor can the researcher identify all of the relevant variables that could have an impact on what happens. Okay, so now when we talk about the different types of um, quantitative research, let me just uh, we've talked about a couple of them. So there's, so on the one side, there is, and it's interesting, there are actually terms used for these. So on the one side, where the researcher has total um, control over all the variables, that is called experimental research. Um, and on the other side of the spectrum, the one we talked about, where basically you're just observing what's happening, is um, basically it's called descriptive research. So you are collecting data about a specific phenomenon and a specific variables, and you really are just describing uh, what uh, what you're saying. Now, with descriptive research um, is usually it's a very basic level. In fact, there isn't much descriptive research in the academic literature. Descriptive research is usually used as just collecting frequencies. So there's a lot of graphs, charts to show the data, but the really descriptive research is entirely on that other end of having no control of the variables. You have so little control, you don't really, it's just collecting data because you don't quite even know what you're looking at. There's a lot of frequency counts, a lot of just saying how often things occur. Now, there is a field of descriptive research in comparative psychology that branches over to human psychology research called ethology, Ethology. That is a type of descriptive research where you are just observing behaviors and describing how often something occurs and under what circumstances it occurs. That is considered to be, yeah, that is in the academic literature. So there is a type of descriptive research where you're just reporting what you observe. And ethology research is very interesting. It's used a lot for like um, studying animal behavior in the wild. So these individuals who go out and spend 6 months observing gorillas. A lot of times they're not even trying to do any sort of analysis or experiment. They're just describing what they observed because usually it's something that doesn't get observed that much. So that's descriptive research. Now, as far as this idea of having no control over the variables, so we've got descriptive research where there's almost no control whatsoever, and there's so little control, people aren't even analyzing the data, they're just reporting what they observe. And experimental is over on this side where you have almost entire control over the variables. From this end, the next one in where there is little control, but there's enough control that you do some statistical analysis, that's correlational research. And that's where you would use correlations, the correlation. And and the reason why um, and then the next one in from this end, this is what's called quasi-experimental. So there's experimental, there's quasi-experimental. Many people would argue that in human psychology research, this is the farthest you can go, that there's no such thing as pure experimental research in human psychological research because you can't control all the variables when it comes to human beings. Um, and then moving in from this end, correlational research is here. So quasi-experimental and correlational research here. The difference statistically is most of the time, not 100% of the time, but most of the time, correlational research would be the correlation coefficient that we talked about and regression analysis. And this would be t-tests and ANOVA. So there's expected that when you're doing a t-test ANOVA, you have more control over the variables than you do when you have correlation and regression analysis. Now, the difference here is because just from a purely scientific point of view in how research is typically run, the thinking is that with correlational research, you have less evidence for clearly stating a causal relationship. Remember, going back to that phrase, um, correlation does not mean causation. With the ANOVA and t-test, because you have more control over the variables, it is thought that what you have is um, more room for saying uh, that that there is evidence for a causal relationship, for saying that your independent variable in some way causes the differences in your dependent variable. Okay, so you see there that with quantitative research, there's a general attempt to have some reflection of the scientific method in what's being done. Um, However, having said that, certainly, especially with human psychological research, it is often seen that there is not enough control over the variables that you can definitively say that any one study proves a causal relationship. So it's thought that with psychology, you need multiple studies all kind of showing the same results before you can really say with any sort of certainty that there's a causal relationship. Okay, a couple other things about formulating a quantitative research design, and this will lead into what you then need to do for a research proposal. Uh, um, it uses what's called inductive, uh, deductive reasoning, where you uh, where you sort of move from this hypothesis, where you have this hypothesis, is sort of, and then you move to a specific collection of data to help prove or not prove your hypothesis. And then basically, when you're developing a quantitative research design, there's a series of 5 steps, and this will all be part of the proposal that you write. The first one is uh, you develop a research topic, and you do that by making an observation about something that is unknown, unexplained, or new, and find out the theory that might explain what's happening there. So your research topic sort of comes from identifying a phenomenon that you think is interesting and tying it together with what the sort of theory is already out there about what might cause something like that. So you basically develop your general research topic. You connect something that you've observed, read about, seen, I mean, observed, read about, um, even heard about from your review of the research or in your own clinical work. Um, and you tie it in with what theory is already out there, um, and what is already known about the variables you're looking at. So that's generally what you do to develop your research topic. Then you move into um, a research question that um, where you ask a question about specifically about how the uh, uh, variables are related that you're looking at. The research question is not the complete step. The research question is important because um, it leads to formulating a hypothesis. So you basically come up with your research topic, and then you have your research question and hypothesis, and that's step 2 because your research question leads to your hypothesis. You ask a question, and then you come up with an educated guess about the uh, what you expect the outcome is going to be. An educated guess. Remember, hypothesis is an educated guess. So step two is this combination of research question and hypotheses. And then step three is you formulate a plan to test your hypothesis. Step four is you collect and process your data. You run your statistical test, and that includes collecting your data and running your statistical analyses. And then five is you summarize your findings and you take your statistical analysis results and you turn it into um, an explanation of what you found. And that explanation includes saying whether your hypothesis was or was not proven, what and how you think that material applies to the general population that you're studying. So one is you formulate a research, going back to the steps, one is you formulate a research topic by taking something that you find interesting and tying it in with what the general theory is about that sort of thing. Two, research question, which leads into your hypotheses. Three, you formulate a plan for testing your hypotheses. Four, you collect and process your data, which includes your statistical analysis. And five, you explain what your statistical analyses results mean. Now, of course, with a proposal, um, um, each one of those steps are followed, but for the last two steps, you only talk about what sort of statistical analyses you plan to use and what you think your findings will mean. Because remember, for a proposal, you haven't actually collected any data yet. Um, so, okay. So those are the steps of a quantitative research design. And it's, you know, wanted to finish it there with a little bit of a discussion of how you go about formulating uh, a research proposal or sort of laying the groundwork for that. And we'll talk more about that in class. Please also, when you come to class, please also prepared to talk about, I'd asked you this week to make sure you had an idea what you wanted your research topic to be and your research question to be. And I'd like you to also be able to talk about your hypotheses. When you leave class on Thursday, I really would like you to have your research question and your hypotheses, because I think you're really going to need that as we move forward with the next set of assignments. Okay, but we'll finish for now, and I'll see everybody on Thursday.